Mr. Andrews, could you, one of the things that you did raise this evening that is new is discussion of primary treatment. You talked about adding some sort of treatment swale on the east side, but with very little detail. And you indicated that would be forthcoming. Is there, do you have the ability to describe that or show us where it is, any characteristics of it that you care to point out at this time?
Absolutely. I've got I've got a slide up there that presents it. I apologize I wasn't able to get it on a 24 by 36, but I do have.
Oh, you have got it. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Good. Okay. So this is what's referred to as a wet swale. The majority of my visits to the site, I have seen water flowing, although most of those visits have certainly been in the winter time. And so we're anticipating that the section, and if I may just bring you back to probably go into this drawing. Okay, the proposed location for this is a better place to start is right over here. Right over here. So there's a discharge pipe that comes from this wetland, as Krista spoke earlier. From this wetland, it goes all the way through pipe right to this location. So this is the wetland.
So wetland 1.
Wetland 1.
It would be receiving the outflow from wetland 1?
Correct.
Which, didn't we talk about wetland 1 wouldn't, in your opinion, be impacted at all?
Correct.
So what is this intended to treat?
It treats the stormwater associated with this portion of the parking area, as well as catch basin located right here. So it essentially services this part of the site.
Another parking area?
Yes. So if I can go back to the detail, what we typically do with those is we'll spot what elevation we need to design them for, and we'll provide a compost base in there and provide plantings. It'll be select plantings, and we'll typically provide a serpentine type apparatus. And what I try to do typically is provide the longest flow line I can through that little section. So what I can do is put some check dams within that, alternating, so that we enhance the contact with that. It's a relatively short section. If I had to estimate, I'd say it's about 50 or 60 feet in length, but we feel that we can further enhance the quality of stormwater. And as I said, in recognition of Mr. Snarsky's request, we wanted to provide that.
Thank you. Does anybody have questions for Mr. Andrews on this specific proposal? No? Before we get to the public comment, there are two areas I do want to explore with you that I want to make sure I understand fully. And they're just broadly. One has to do with flood risk and mitigation, and the other with the materials themselves. And I'll deal with the flood risk mitigation first, right? So, as you pointed out, the finished floor elevation is 3 feet below the base flood level, which is the 100-year FEMA flood elevation. As I don't recall if it was the intervenor or if it was DTC, there could be other flooding events that are obviously greater than 9 feet, but are not at the 12-foot 100-year flood elevation. And I don't know if you have a recurrence interval for any of those types of events, but flood mitigation, obviously you could approach this with wet or dry flood proofing, and you chose wet flood proofing, right, to allow essentially the area to flood and flood waters to recede, and your plan speaks to that, right? This is your flood management plan is attachment C of your March 2nd, 2018 response to comments. So we have a copy of that. And in that, you indicate that upon receipt of a valid forecast for significant flooding up to an elevation of 8 feet or higher within the Clinton area, the following actions shall be taken. All liquids shall be placed on a rack system with a deck elevation of 13 feet or greater, or removed from the site before the storm event occurs. Unprocessed and processed stockpiles of construction and demolition debris located within the building on the tipping floor shall be shipped from the site so as to retain minimal material within the building. It is not anticipated that all of this material will be removed, but the overall volume shall be reduced. The question I've got is, some of this seems a bit subjective, and I underscore valid forecast for significant flooding. What would you consider to be a valid flood warning? And I think that's important because on page 6 of that same letter that I referenced, you indicate that we're fortunate that in floods of this magnitude can be reasonably forecast up to 10 days ahead of the occurrence. This allows for adequate time to protect the facility from the potential impacts from such an event. And I'm not a certified floodplain manager, but I'm fortunate to know some, and I reached out to some of them, just really to educate myself. And one fellow, Dave Murphy at my one in McBroom, he's a CF, and he does a lot of municipal coastal work, and his opinion was that there are any number of types of events, not just flooding events, but if you were to use National Weather Service forecast, in his opinion, he would recommend that a winter storm warning, flood, blizzard, tropical storm, or hurricane all have the potential to cause flooding of this type of magnitude that we're talking about. And the ability to forecast 10 days in advance and ship material out in all of those scenarios, to me, seems very unlikely, because I don't think you've got 10 days notice. So I'd like your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, I would agree. I think 10 days is probably aggressive in my statement there, but I think we've all experienced considerable flooding events. For example, Storm Sandy, where we had considerable forecast of flooding associated with that. And this particular site that was unimpacted. It didn't rise to the level of actually impacting this, but I think we all were able to experience that as a relatively recent storm event, significant storm event, where the weather services were very successful, I think, in establishing what they felt was going to be a significant tide, significant wind situation, and produce significant flooding within certain coastal towns. So I think the opportunity for understanding that is certainly current and certainly there, and typically forecast well ahead of what we would certainly need to mitigate what we feel would be most appropriate for an incoming storm. As I mentioned, I think the first and foremost would be to start shipping material and reduce receipt of material at the facility so that we can reduce the tipping floor load, the material located on the tipping floor. We also, as indicated in the management plan, would either eliminate the liquids that are stored at the facility or raise those to an elevation of 13 pedestal type storage. And we would move the heavy equipment essentially up the hill. The driveway entrance to this goes up to elevation 28 or so. So it gives us plenty of time to implement that. I think we feel very comfortable that we'd be successful in implementing that on probably as short as, provided there wasn't a weekend in the middle, but probably as short as a 2 or 3 day notification. And we could certainly handle the simpler stuff, such as moving the equipment and relocating liquid materials, certainly within a day's notice. Shipping the material from the site, shutting down incoming loads is a little bit more difficult, takes a little bit more forecast.
But I appreciate that response, but your wet-proofing flood management plan does call for having sufficient time to take certain mitigation activities, and it seems like a large part of that plan calls for removing the majority of material from the site, which doesn't seem like you're saying you'd be able to do in all cases. Right, and I guess what I'm saying is you can't guarantee sufficient advance notice to remove the bulk of, or ideally, all of the material out of the tipping room floor, which will be flooded at that point.
That's correct, I couldn't guarantee that.
Is there the feasibility of putting all of the material above 12 feet MSL?
Well, when we initially looked at the project, we had a couple of options. One would be to raise the slab floor to elevation 12 or elevation 13 in accordance with your regulations, and we contemplated that. And the difficulty we have with that is that we would need to provide compensatory flood storage for that portion of material that we'd be filling with that. And the site is very challenging. It's got a very shallow water table. It's got pavement and paved parking areas and roads that basically surround the building structure. The only area that we could possibly do that would be across the north of the site, up in this area, which would be right up here. And unfortunately, that's bedrock. It's exposed bedrock along here, and we have that wetland, which is located up there. So it doesn't afford us a real opportunity to provide reasonable compensatory flood storage within that, which is why we didn't raise that slab floor.
Have your, still on the same topic of flood and potential for flooding, have any of your calculations taken into account potential sea level rise?
No, we haven't looked at that at all.
CERCLA recently came out with a paper, happy to share with you. I have a copy here by James O'Donnell. He's a PhD there. I don't know if you know them, but they're funded by the state of Connecticut, associated with UConn, and this is what they're tasked with doing, essentially looking at impacts along, especially along the shoreline. And their projection for Clinton is that basically that this area of the state, not just Clinton, but by 2050, so basically within 30 years, they're saying plan for 50 centimeters of sea level rise, so it's 20 inches. So I'm curious as to whether or not you've looked at what that might do as far as the potential for flooding and exacerbation of the flooding impacts that you're planning for.
Clearly, if that manifests, it would certainly increase the frequency of flooding that we would see at the site. I think that's fairly clear and obvious. We're comfortable with the flood management plan that we have and the implementation of that, and the screening that we're provided to contain the materials that are stored within the building structure that will be successful in removing the heavy equipment, removing the liquids from the flood's way, and retaining the products that are stored within the building facility, within the building itself when flood occurrences do arise. As I mentioned, we would certainly have preferred the ability to raise the slab elevation, but we would have had some significant challenges associated with that, with the compensatory flood storage requirements.
Does anybody have questions on flooding? You guys got, yeah.
Since you're no longer using that external area for stockpiling, to the area to the east of where your proposed building is, have you looked at that area as a possible of removing the slab and doing your flood storage in that area so that it would allow you to use the footprint of your proposed building to raise it up to elevation 12 above the 100-year?
Actually, we didn't look at that at all. We just cut the stockpile out 10 days ago or so. So we didn't look at the removal of that. That was actually a pretty significant part of our plan, was aggregate storage as well. So it took us a little while to actually separate from that, but we did not necessarily look at that at this point. But it certainly could be an excellent provision for the additional 3 feet that we would need there. Certainly chip away at that volume of material.
Anybody else, commissioners? No? One last question on oh, do you have that? Sorry. Eddie, Chris?
You mentioned that you're not permitted to carry or to accept wet waste. But what is the process if a truck does come in with wet waste? I mean, how do you know that it's in there?
Rejected. The loads are rejected. We have a responsibility under the solid waste permit to inspect a certain, typically they'll write the permit with a certain frequency of inspections of loads. It's typically not every single load. However, the majority of the facilities that I'm associated with and work with actually inspect every load that comes in.
Or do you have somebody go and dump in it?
There's a
Do you know?
couple of different methods. One, many of these facilities, and in fact probably this facility, would be required to actually have a Geiger counter. As the vehicles come in, they pass under that. And the majority of them, since that's over the load, will provide a camera up there so that the scale house operator can actually observe what's in the load, and as the truck is pulling up to the scale, they have them drop the tarp at that point so that they can perform that inspection. But typically the majority of the facilities that I've been working with as of late have been inspecting every load.
All set, Andrew? Okay. One last question on flood elevation. I did speak to DEP, the folks that you've been in contact with your application, both for Frank Gagliardo and Gabby Frignell. And one of the things that Gabby had indicated is that in a meeting with you, she did, because of this question of sea level, potential for sea level rise, to meet with the town and explore with the town whether or not they're reconsidering their coastal setbacks. And she was unaware if you had done that. So I'm curious as to whether or not you've reached out to the town, and whether or not you are discussing with the town whether or not the coastal setbacks need to be revised.
We haven't done that at this point. We took notes at the meeting that she was referring to, and the department was required to follow up with an RFI, a request for information in writing. So we refrained from actually any action on that meeting until such time as we received the written document. We were in touch with them approximately 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, and the document actually just came in last week. So at this point, we're in a position to move forward with the preparation of the response to that. And in fact, we only have 30 days at this point to respond to that. So that's something that we would be actuating within the next 30 days. But we haven't done that.
So the status of your application with DEEP is they determined your application was sufficient, but they did have a request for additional information.
That's
They
indeed.
provided that to you, and you have a 30-day window to respond.
That's
You're
correct.
working on that.
Yes.
Might your response to your DEEP application alter your proposal?
We don't believe so. As I mentioned, we did talk about the subjects of it, the questions and such that they had at the meeting. We did jot down notes. I believe we're aware of all of the issues that they have, although the RFI may have had a couple of last-minute zingers that we haven't seen at this particular point. But we didn't see anything at that particular meeting that concerned us that it would impact the application that we have in front of you.
I think I said that might have been the last question, but it wasn't.
That's okay.
I do have a question on your new proposal for that you had a detail of showing the screening along with mesh, and given that you're saying that the material on the tipping room floor may or may not be removed in certain quantities. It may be partially removed, it may be somewhat removed. Nonetheless, it will be flooded. And it is your belief that this cable reinforced galvanized mesh containment structure will be sufficient to protect downstream wetlands from soluble pollutants? Or what are you thinking this will, I think we've had comments thus far in the record that it seems that it is not designed to protect against soluble pollutants, but it is going to entrain and trap larger floatables and things of that sort, possibly sediment, things of that nature. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed.
And so do you have a proposal to treat, as floodwaters recede, are you proposing to treat in any way any discharge that could be contaminated because of what is on the tipping root floor at that point?
Short of the mesh protection that we have, short of the screening, no.
Yes. I'm sorry?
No.
No.
No, short of the mesh. Our intent is essentially to contain that material within the building structure. You gotta give me.
Yeah, sorry, just, you're gonna have to, unless you want him to convey that, if you don't mind, just for the record, so we can get it, because folks can't hear. Thank you.
I'm the property owner of Old Post Road, and we bought the property probably Richard Kowaleski.
Thank you,
And
Richard.
we bought the property probably 4 years ago, 5 years ago. It was a collapsed building, and we applied for a demolition permit, and started in April of 2013 to clean the building up. The building was on the ground for 2 years. No one complained about it. There was a blight ordinance put against the owners, and that's why they decided to sell the piece of property. We bought it, and we cleaned it up. It took 4 months, and for 4 months I worked outside with heavy equipment on the property with the mesh cleanup. Never contaminated the wetlands. Nobody ever came down to say hi or, hey Rick, what are you doing? You know, but we cleaned up the place. I moved 40 to 50 truckloads of material a day out of there. I also used the rail to do the C&D. Worked 7 days a week because I was under a window where I had to get the building cleaned up by July 31st of 2013 or 2014. But being on the property for 4 months, trucks coming in and out of there, trucks coming in, filling up my equipment with oil or diesel fuel. Not one person ever came down to the property to see what I was doing, or, I mean, the noise on Sundays and Saturdays, because I ran the equipment myself, I was a little bit nervous about doing it. But you guys live 500 feet away, and no one came over and said hi, or hey, you know, are you allowed to be doing this? No, the commission. And it boggles my mind that see, we ran a transfer station for 4 months with no one to complain. We cleaned up the mess. Cost us over $700,000 to clean up the mess. And now I want to build a facility and run it inside of a building, and now everybody wants to, or the commission wants to give me a hard time.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. So, Mr. Andrews, if I could, I want to talk about the materials for a little bit, and then, what time is it here? Oh gosh, I'm sorry folks, will you indulge me a little bit to pursue a line of questioning on the material, and then we can get to your comments. So, the proposed commercial reduction, this is, as I understand it, a commercial volume reduction facility for C&D waste, correct?
Correct.
And that as a volume reduction facility, there's no municipal solid waste, no hazardous waste, right? And that's what you're seeking deep approval for.
Construction and demolition debris.
Construction and demolition, correct. And your application before them is for 2,500 tons per day. that would consist primarily of wood, gypsum, masonry, concrete, asphalt, shingles, associated oversized municipal solid waste, such as furniture and mattresses, as well as non-hazardous contaminated soil. Materials that will be recovered for recycling will include aluminum antifreeze, lead acid batteries, mixed batteries, computers and electronics, used oil, oil filters, paints and stains, appliances with CFCs, shingles, stainless steel tires, cardboard, ferrous iron, sheetrock, single stream recyclables, plastics, copper wire, clean unpainted wood, concrete, and propane tanks with valves. This is from your application, Doc.
Correct.
It is anticipated that there may be incidental electronic equipment and appliances, batteries, paints, and stains commingled with the C&D waste. Right? That's from your executive summary attachment B, dated March 2nd, 2018, response to comments. So I just want to confirm that nothing has changed, correct, as far as what you're proposing to be bringing into that site. That all holds true.
Yes, just let me clarify. As I mentioned during my earlier testimony, all of the facility is going to be permitted for construction and demolition debris. We anticipate that all of those products listed could be mixed in, commingled with the C&DD. And in fact, based upon the experience of the operator, that's what formulated us adding provisions for all of those materials. So we're not receiving batteries, we're not receiving propane containers, etc. We're receiving C&D, separating that material, and that's the way it goes. But the facility is going to be permitted for the C&DD. Those incidentals will essentially be sorted out of that material.
Sure. And have you or have you not amended your permit request with DEEP to allow for additional materials?
We have not.
You have not?
No.
Okay. I wasn't sure in talking with Gabby Famion whether or not you did revise it to allow for putrescent MSW.
MSW. Now, she specifically indicated we're not going to permit you for that in our meeting, and that's in the RFI, so that will be stricken
So
from the
that will be taken out.
application.
So
Yeah.
you may have been asking for it, but now you're going to be taking that out.
Yep,
So
exactly.
no putrescent MSW.
Yeah.
Okay, it's further my understanding from my conversations with them that there is no requirement in DEEP's Waste Engineering Enforcement Division per their regulations that for any testing of any inbound material. Is that correct?
From a DEEP perspective, that's correct.
And you're not proposing any testing before this application? You're not going above and beyond the DEEP requirement, their regulation, and saying we will, regardless of what DEEP does or doesn't require, we are going to test every load that comes in?
No, we're not proposing that. And once again, I think in the last month's testimony, we presented the sequence of how the demolition permit is actually required.
Right.
And the testing is actually performed at that earlier stage.
Yes. No, I appreciated that. That helped inform me. But I was still a little bit confused because of last month, some of the discussion, some of the other folks who commented on residential waste. And so in discussing this with DEEP, again, this is my understanding from conversations with the permitting folks, that their definition of C&D waste actually does allow for residential cleanouts, which could include quantities of household hazardous waste. Because it's not considered hazardous material by EPA or state statute, right? Because it's residentially generated. So I just want to clarify that. Is that your understanding also, is that even though you're applying for a C&D permit from the state, because they do not regulate residentially generated hazardous waste, it could conceivably contain quantities of that?
It's interesting to actually hear that perspective, because in the application that we prepared and in the application guidance document, it specifically identifies that hazardous waste cannot be received at the facility, and if it is, you need to quarantine the load and such and take certain actions to report it immediately to the DEP and remove that material, put it in a specific location. So I think the incidence of that would be extremely low. and would certainly be a surprise to the operator of the facility.
But it's still possible.
Could be possible, absolutely, yep. And it would be sorted out, as I mentioned, and it would be addressed in accordance with what the permit requirements are. And don't forget, now, once it's received at the facility, inadvertently, that material has to go somewhere. So at that point, it is regulated. So the objective would certainly be not to receive it, but if it is received and you're not able to bring it back to the facility, you have certain actions that you have to take in accordance with regulation at that particular point. And you'd be bound to implement that.
So if a load comes in that's contaminated, because it was from somebody's roll-off dumpster, and you see this all the time, people are cleaning out their basements, they're cleaning out their garage, whatever. I'm not saying I'm guilty of ever doing it, but I know people who've done this, where they've just chucked all manner of stuff in there, right? That, you're saying, if it ever came in, would be segregated and contained and removed and treated in a special way? Is that what you're saying?
Reject the load, Rick?
So you are inspecting every load before you tip it?
Sorry.
Because I thought previously you said you don't inspect every load. There's no specific screening.
Every load that comes into the facility does get inspected.
This is-
The minute you open up the door, you see something in the load that doesn't belong in the load, that truck is pulled out of the building or pulled over to the side. We have two things we can do. We can call deep, or we can call the EPA, and we'll see how bad it is. And that truck is confiscated and cannot leave the facility until deep comes down and tags the material and then sends the material to a specific location that will accept that material.
So how do you, again, I'm just trying to make sure I understand this. So the process is, the identification process, I guess I want to make sure I understand. So if someone is throwing just chucking some pesticide into their roll-off dumpster and it happens to break open and contaminate whatever else they've thrown in there, cushions and wood and whatever, you have a way of identifying that this is contaminated?
Yeah, that truck would be pulled out, away from everybody else, put to the side. We make a telephone call to deep and have them come in out and inspect the loads.
Okay, thank you.
And we send stuff to the burn plant in Bridgeport all the time, and the same thing happens. Your truck pulls into the burn plant at Resco in Bridgeport, and they open up the door and they see something that's not supposed to be in there. That truck is tagged, put to the side until deep could get down there to inspect the load, and until that driver and the owners of the vehicle were to go with the load.
I think the concern that I've got is not necessarily that could happen and that it could be having to be dealt with whatever the process entails. It's that there's the potential at some point that happens and you have some flooding event and you've got now contaminated material in the building that is now going to impact wetlands downgrading. That's the concern that I have. But did folks have other questions on materials before we move quickly to public comment? No? All right. All right, thanks for indulging me, folks. It is about 7 minutes to. We will move to the public comment period. Is there anyone here who signed up who wants to speak in favor of the application? Wait, there's a whole...